and Cardinal Gantin simply issued a statement saying that what Archbishop Lefebvre did in and of itself incurs the penalty of excommunication. Basically, what this declaration is saying is that Archbishop Lefebvre has excommunicated himself by his own actions. Legally, such a declaration has absolutely no force whatever. It's only trying to state a fact, and in this case, it has been already demonstrated theologically and legally that that is an erroneous opinion and that he has not excommunicated himself. Therefore, the arguments to the effect that Archbishop Lefebvre and the bishops he ordained have been excommunicated, it has been clearly demonstrated that those arguments are not valid, and therefore they have not been excommunicated. Number one, they have not been excommunicated. Now, what about the question of schism? Have they fallen into schism? The Dean of Canon Law at the Catholic Institute of Paris, which is a Novus Ordo institution, I might add, explained in very precise terms that no, Archbishop Lefebvre and the bishops he ordained did not fall into schism simply by committing that forbidden act. Because an act of schism is when someone rejects the authority of the Pope. Now, a distinction has to be made between disobeying the Pope and rejecting his authority, not being subject to the authority of the Pope. Now, to be a schismatic, one must reject utterly. One must separate himself from the authority of the Pope. One must be no longer subject to the Pope's authority. The contrary case would be mere disobedience. If the Pope gives a command and you disobey, you are disobedient. You are not thereby schismatic. But this is the confusion in the minds of so many bishops and clergy, and this only proves how ignorant they are of canon law and theology. It just proves, I think the Catholic faith will have to wake up and just see how ignorant their church leaders really are. They are so moronic in their way of thinking that they can no longer distinguish between disobedience and schism. They have to go back to school and get a refresher course because their minds become very clouded, and they can't make the simplest elementary distinctions that any well-educated seminarian would have no difficulty tackling such a question. And yet they have stumbled. They have been stumped by these questions and have fallen into error. The case of Archbishop Lefebvre is a very clear-cut case of disobedience. Now, I'm not yet going to answer the question, is that disobedience justified or not justified? First, I'm answering the question, is it disobedience or is it schism? Well, very clearly, it is disobedience. The Church historically has always regarded that as a very serious disobedience, but it is only a disobedience. The Church has never taught that the mere fact that you ordain a bishop makes you a schismatic. To be a formal schismatic, which cuts you off from the body of the Church, you must declare yourself to be separated from the authority of the Pope. If you declare, the Pope is not my superior, he has no authority over me, if you say that, then you are indeed a schismatic. You're excommunicated. And another example would be, for example, to reject entirely the jurisdiction of the Pope. For example, if I were a bishop and I were to consecrate one of these men bishop, and the Pope were to say, no, you can't do that, and I say, well, Holy Father, I'm doing it anyways, and I were to ordain them a bishop, I would be gravely sinful, and I would be excommunicated, and I would be gravely disobedient, but I would not be a schismatic. However, if I were to tell the Holy Father, what I do is none of your business, you're not my superior, I'm going to ordain these men bishops, and I'm going to confer upon them the jurisdiction to govern dioceses, then I would be a schismatic if I were to do that. And this was explained by the Dean of Canon Law at the Catholic Institute of Paris. For a bishop to ordain another bishop and to presume to be able to confer jurisdiction on that bishop, that would be challenging the Pope's jurisdiction. That would truly be an act of schism. But Archbishop Lefebvre made it very, very clear that he had no intention of conferring any kind of jurisdiction. He made it very clear and very plain that it is to preserve the Society of St. Pius X, it is to preserve the traditional rights of the Mass and the administration of the sacraments, and that alone is the motivation why he thought it necessary to perform this act of disobedience, which was to consecrate bishops. Clearly, therefore, it does not involve any kind of schism. In fact, the bishops of the Society of St. Pius X rotate. There'll be one bishop who's performing, for example, confirmations in North America. In the following year, a different bishop will come in and perform the confirmations. And they do this as a public gesture to show that they have no pretense of exercising any kind of territorial jurisdiction. It is not as though there's one bishop who's in charge of North America and another bishop in charge of South America and another bishop having some kind of jurisdiction over Europe. They're making it very clear by rotating that none of these bishops is claiming any kind of jurisdiction, that they're only doing this out of default because the local ordinaries have no intention of performing or even permitting the traditional ceremonies in the solemn administration of the sacraments and in the celebration of the Holy Mass. Therefore, their motivation is very clear. It is to preserve the traditional rights of the Church, and they make no pretense, no claim to jurisdiction. For that reason, the verdict to be made is very clear. They do not, according to Catholic teaching, they are not in schism. And if anyone tries to tell you that they are in schism, that one is in error. And when the local clergy and when the bishops are saying, if you go to their Mass, you get excommunicated because they're in schism, well, those people are lying to you. They are the ones who are ignorant. And it's about time that the faithful be more informed about that, and they should know well that the clergy, in too many cases, are trying to put one over on them, trying to enforce their ignorance on the people. It is time that Catholic people be aware of the fact that this is a statement of their own malice and of their own ignorance. That, morally speaking, there is no objection to why a person may not attend a Mass celebrated by priests of the Society of St. Pius X. If I may have, I don't know if I've covered everything there. Was there another question? Oh, one final thing. That's what as far as disobedience, you've heard it said, the will of the bishop is the will of God. The will of the Pope is the will of God. Never disobey. Blind obedience? No. I give the example of Saint Athanasius. He disobeyed Pope Liberius, and Pope Liberius excommunicated him. Athanasius never repented for his disobedience, and yet he is a saint, a canonized saint and doctor of the church, because there was a moral imperative for him to resist the Pope. The Pope was favoring the heretics. The heretics were giving out a profession of faith which was ambiguous, which could be interpreted as to deny the divinity of the second person of the Blessed Trinity. A Christological heresy. I mean, that's to deny any dogma of the faith, of course, a person falls into heresy. But there is a hierarchy of dogmas. Some dogmas are greater and more sublime than others. And certainly the divinity of the second person of the Blessed Trinity is one of the principal dogmas of our faith. And if the Pope should do something that would cast doubt upon the divinity of the second person of the Blessed Trinity, that is to subject the Catholic faith to a very grave danger. And the teaching of the Church is very clear that even the Pope is to be resisted in such an event. And when this ambiguous formula of the profession of faith was signed by Pope Liberius, for the sake of unity and peace in the church, he didn't want anybody to be opposing it. Well, St. Athanasius opposed it very strenuously. And for his trouble, he was excommunicated. And it was not in spite of his disobedience, but because of the heroic virtue that he displayed in disobeying even the Pope. And the suffering he had to go through, I imagine, was very intense. You know how it feels to be an outcast, to be excommunicated. Well, ask Archbishop Lefebvre. I don't think he enjoyed it one bit. But what did he get for his trouble? St. Athanasius has the honors of the altar. He is a saint, and the Mass is celebrated in his honor, because he had the courage to oppose even the Pope and to disobey in public, even the Pope. And because of that, he is a saint. He is a saint of the Catholic Church, and his feast is celebrated every year. So that proves, for one thing, that sometimes it is not only permissible, but sometimes it is necessary to disobey the Pope. And Pope Innocent III, in his book, De Consuetudine, says that if the Pope should depart from the universal customs of the Church, he is not to be followed. Now, the universal custom of the Church, of course, especially is the Roman rite of the Mass, which is popularly called the Tridentine Mass, and the solemn administration of the sacraments according to the traditional rites. These have been the universal custom of the Church for many centuries. And Pope Innocent III teaches that if the Pope departs from those universal customs, he is not to be followed. And therefore, it is not wrong to be disobedient to the Pope in such circumstances. There is a higher law, a higher obedience, which is, as St. Peter says, we must obey God rather than men. And in the profession of faith of Pope Pius IV, it is solemnly set forth that we must adhere to the received and approved ceremonies used in the solemn administration of the sacraments. What we mean by received, of course, is those rites and ceremonies that we have received from the Church, that the bishops have received from their predecessors, and so on and so forth, from the fathers down through the ages. The received and approved ceremonies of the Church are the traditional rites of the Church. And therefore, the profession of faith solemnly declares that we must adhere to the traditional rites. Our faith demands this of us, and therefore, there is full justification and a moral imperative to follow the traditions and customs of the Church and not to be led astray by modernist innovations. And this was further emphasized, for example, in the teaching of Francisco Suarez, recognized universally as the greatest Theological Mind and History of the Jesuit Order.